Hey everyone, a belated welcome to 2024. What's your New Year's resolution? Mine is to review fewer horror games and cover a wider range of genres and styles. So to kick things off, here's a review of Stay Out of the House, a horror game. 2024's off to a good start. This isn't a joke, by the way. I actually do want to cover other genres, but once I started playing Stay Out of the House, I knew I had to talk about it. It got its hooks into me almost instantly. It kept me guessing the whole way. It's one of the best horror games I've played in a while, and it's also one of the most frustrating, so let's talk about it. But before I get my hands into the guts of this game, I'm going to slap down a big old spoiler warning, because Stay Out of the House is one of those rare games you can really only play once. A repeat playthrough is never going to be as effective as a first run, and it's best experienced without any prior knowledge on what's going to happen. If you enjoyed Resident Evil 7 and vibe with PS1 era retro graphics, I guarantee you'll love a lot of Stay Out of the House. But if you need a little more convincing, or just don't care, feel free to watch on. Also, if you enjoy the video and want to support the channel, please like, subscribe, let me know what you think down in the comments, and especially share it around, because YouTube sure as hell won't. Anyway, let's get to it. Stay Out of the House was released in 2022, after several years in early access, and is the work of Puppet Combo, a name you're probably already familiar with if you're a fan of indie horror games. His work, both as a developer under the name Puppet Combo and as a publisher under the name Torture Star Video, tend toward horror games inspired by PS1 era graphics and the cheesy slasher and giallo films of the 70s and 80s. Murder House is another title developed by Puppet Combo. Bloodwash is an example of a game published by Torture Star Video. I haven't played all of them because there's just so many in various states of completion, but from those I have experienced firsthand and the trailers I've seen for the myriad titles made by Puppet Combo or published by Torture Star Video, they're a little tongue-in-cheek in their execution, but that doesn't mean they're not scary. If anything, that disconnect in tone can help to make them even scarier. I didn't think a man in a pink rabbit suit could be threatening, but somehow it works. I honestly kind of want to do a whole retrospective on Puppet Combo and Torture Star Video, because there is so much to talk about, but what drew me to Stay Out of the House specifically is that the usual tonal disconnect isn't there. The game might still be heavily inspired by early survival horror games and schlocky slasher flicks, but there's less of an absurdist angle to it. There are moments where it definitely gets a little surreal, but never by trying to create a dissonance between the horror of your situation and the silliness of the monster pursuing you. Aside from Resident Evil 7, Stay Out of the House is heavily inspired by another indie horror game called Granny, and that's not just me speculating, that's straight from the puppet's mouth. Now, I've never played Granny or any of its sequels, but even from just watching trailers and let's plays, the influence is obvious. But where Resident Evil 7 and Granny, at least from the promotional material I've seen, create a horror mood through the disconnect between the kookiness of their antagonists and the terrifying things they do, Stay Out of the House plays its own killer completely straight. The Butcher is viscerally unpleasant in everything he does, and is an overwhelming presence even once you learn how he works mechanically. In terms of presentation, he's perfect. Probably the most effective horror game antagonist for me since the Xenomorph of Alien Isolation, and you have just as many options in dealing with him as in that title too. By the time Stay Out of the House really gets going, you've already failed to heed the title's advice, and now there's only one thing for you to do: survive long enough to escape. The game doesn't really have a plot so much as it has lore, which we'll discuss in more detail a little bit later. There are story beats to hit, but they're few and far between, and overall the narrative is emergent rather than set in stone, even if the four possible endings can't actually be changed in any way by the player. Broken though. Oh boy. I've said before that story is one of the most important aspects of a game for me, but in this case I think the lack of any definitive plot is what makes Stay Out of the House so special. I'm not actually a fan of slasher flicks or giallo movies, in fact I've hated most of the ones I've seen, but even so I have very strong opinions on what I'd do if ever I found myself in a similar sort of scenario to a Friday the 13th film or a Dario Argento joint, and this game let me put my money where my mouth is. Stay Stay Out of the House is an interactive slasher film, and you can play it however you like, because it's also an immersive sim. It doesn't start off that way, but as you open up more of the house and scavenge more tools from its hidden corners, you can amass quite the bag of tricks. Rocks might make for a cheap and nasty distraction for if you need the butcher to move, but an alarm clock will get the job done just as well, and from a much safer distance too. Do you turn on the lights to give yourself a better chance of finding things at the risk of leaving yourself exposed? Do you risk making noise with a walk or run, or try to be as quiet as possible? Do you stick to the vents, take out the security cameras, turn the butcher's own tools against him, pick up a gun and choose violence? The game accommodates pretty much any playstyle, to the point where I was able to get through the entire thing without using any of the distraction tools once. I aimed for stealth, using darkness, closed doors, and the lead character's swift crouch walk to hide from the butcher when I could, and a loaded gun when I couldn't. The butcher can't be killed, of course, but a couple of shots to the chest will send him packing long enough for you to find a hiding spot, and that's just one of the uses the gun has. Fire off a shot and the butcher will come running from pretty much anywhere else in the house, making it one hell of a distraction. And what is a bullet if not a universal lockpick? You only get 6 shots maximum, and you have to manually load in each and every bullet. It is a revolver after all, so you have to pick the moments when you actually pull the trigger very carefully, but that only adds to the tension of any given moment. You can aim down sights for extra accuracy, but even a single shot will send the crosshair spinning across the screen, so if you're going to pull the trigger more than once, make sure whatever you're shooting at is too close for you to miss. The gun isn't even the only item in the game to have more than one use. Several of the tools you find around the house can double as weapons in a pinch, which is great. The stealth system will be pretty familiar to anyone who's ever played Thief. You can find a little device to measure how much light you're standing in, but there are other trinkets hidden around the house to determine your audio levels, and a radar to keep watch on your surroundings too. Leaning from side to side won't keep you in complete darkness, but zooming in by holding in the right mouse button when you're not holding a weapon will keep you safe, and get you a better look at something far away. The butcher is attracted to noise, so keeping low to the ground and avoiding raising the decibel level with a slammed door or a tossed chair is generally a pretty good idea. The butcher isn't completely defenseless. There are cameras, tripwires, and other security measures littered throughout the house, and setting any of them off will probably result in a few blows to the head. Rely too much on certain hiding spots or vent escapes, and the butcher will go out of his way to take them away from you. Toward the end of the game, I felt like the balance of power had shifted, that I was in control of the house just as much as the butcher, and that felt great. Combined with the game's presentation, it genuinely feels like a game of cat and mouse between you and the killer. Even knowing how he worked while playing this second run through for this video, he was still able to surprise me once or twice, like when I came across him just having a think in this room for a little bit. And that's all before you get into the process of escaping. You don't have complete freedom. There are certain areas of the house that can only be accessed in a specific order, but I was surprised at the level of flexibility you as a player do have. There are certain locks that can't be picked, and eventually you will find your way around to the other side of most of them by following the intended progression path, but it's not your only option. The key is hanging right off the butcher's hip if you're brave enough to snatch it off his belt. The house is overflowing with cabinets, cupboards, and drawers to check for items and notes too, many of which are very useful, and many of which have locks that need to be picked, with a hex key and a paperclip rather than a gun, although I never tried, so I don't know, maybe you can. Lockpicking is simple, but it can be intense when you know the butcher is nearby, especially if you're in a heavy traffic area like the front hall, but the rewards are worth it. Bullets, paperclips, and bandages were always welcome, but the real treasures were the notes, which often contained information on how to solve the next puzzle, or VHS tapes, with which you can save your game. They are easily the most precious thing you can find, especially for me as an unrepentant save scummer. Some of the game's most intense moments for me were when when I was hours past the last save without a VHS to fall back on once I got to safety. You have a limited inventory too, although it can be expanded. You keep copies of each note you read on the inventory screen as well, which is very useful when trying to solve one of the game's many puzzles. But surprisingly, you don't have any kind of map, at least none that I found. The house is large for a real-world living space, and some parts of it only make sense in hindsight, but it's not exactly sprawling, even if it feels that way when you first start out. A lot of the game's early tension comes from your unfamiliarity with the environment, and I think that's only elevated by the lack of a map on which to check your progress. Encounters with the Butcher are way more intense when you can't pause to check a map for the quickest route back to safety. It was too much information for me to keep straight in my head, so I went the old school route of drawing out a map of the house with a pen and paper, which was surprisingly satisfying. There were so many "oh shit" moments when I realised how parts of the house fit together. By the end of the game, it was covered in crossed out item locations and scribbled puzzle hints. It felt much more personal and rewarding to create than if the game had included a map as part of the UI. But even if the Butcher does manage to corner you, it's not the end of the world. He doesn't actually kill you. Instead, you're captured, relieved of your items, and locked away in another area of the house. It's easy enough to escape, but once you do, you'll find things have changed. Each time you're caught, you'll escape to find the hallways watched by more security cameras, the floors littered with more bear traps, and the corridors patrolled by more enemies, assuming you haven't dealt with them already. What the hell is that? I actually really like this mechanic. It's less final than a death, but it's still punishing in the way the house changes. And it even makes sense within the context of the story. You're still fully capable of undoing all those changes, and once you figure out where the Butcher is keeping your old inventory items, there's not exactly much he can do to stop you taking them back ever again. There is another way you can stop him from robbing you after a bonk on the head. Just drop the items. Anything not in your inventory will just be lying there on the floor where you dropped it once you find your way out of your new cage. The Butcher won't keep locking you up forever though. You've got 3 attempts, and then it's over for good. You're not making it out of this one, but if you really want to speedrun your way into the grave, just sit back and watch some TV. If you haven't got any Butcher Be Gone in your inventory, you could always just run. You can't run backwards, which, you know, is pretty accurate, but you can look over your shoulder while you're sprinting, which is a nice touch. You can't run forever, but the bar is pretty generous. It should be more than enough to get you to safety from anywhere in the house. The puzzles are pretty standard survival horror stuff too. You've got inventory puzzles, scavenger hunts, the odd padlock or two. There are a couple of real brain ticklers in there, and one of the hardest puzzles in the game was just getting the Butcher away from the kitchen long enough to interact with a nearby cabinet. They're all pretty well telegraphed through the environment, and it's always worth checking the notes you find around the house because they do contain hints. What's most fun is that despite them all being as weird as some of the puzzles you'd encounter in the early Resident Evil games, the way they're framed here as part of an ongoing battle between the Butcher and his previous victims who also escaped their cages actually goes a long way in justifying the strangeness, at least until the final area where they all become pretty obtuse, but I'll get into more detail on that in the section with spoilers. The last aspect of the gameplay to talk about here is the difficulty settings. There are 4 in total. Explore just lets you play the game without any enemies if you want to experience the atmosphere. Easy and medium include the enemies with increasing levels of intelligence and various other changes. For example, I believe the higher the difficulty, the more security cameras there will be at the beginning of the game. I played the game on medium because it is the intended experience, but there's also hard mode, which adds the extra layer of survival mechanics. According to the difficulty options screen, you have to manage hunger, thirst, and bleeding, all of which come with their own extra items, which to me just sounds like a chore. I hate having to cook and sleep to keep myself alive as it is. I certainly don't want to do that shit in a video game, but the increased enemy awareness does sound intriguing now that I've finished Stay Out of the House twice, and basically can't be challenged by medium anymore. I don't know. It's probably not for me, but if that sounds like your sort of thing, go nuts. Don't let me stop you. Stay Out of the House is pretty accommodating to the player in other ways too. The game's default visual style is meant to emulate an old worn-out VHS tape on a CRT monitor, scan lines and all, but you have multiple crunchy options to choose from, including an off switch. I turned off most of the effects and capped the frame rate to 60 for this video, not just in the hope that you might actually be able to see something through YouTube's usual compression, but because OBS did not like recording the game with all the bells and whistles on. The game is normally meant to look like this, and it's how I would recommend playing it too. The game does look very crunchy this way, to the point where it's genuinely difficult to read some of the flavor text at times, but it creates such a mood that playing without those effects just feels off to me. It takes a lot to recreate that kind of low fidelity analog look on modern day digital hardware, and without it there's just something missing. There are already so many retro horror games out there that walk the low poly road without stopping to recognise what made their inspiration such classics to begin with, and without all the visual effects working to recreate the feeling of staring at a CRT monitor, Stay Out of the House just looks like any other old school indie terror title. Without them, the static that appears whenever the butcher is nearby, or the tracking bar at the bottom of the screen that represents the player's stamina, stand out as if they don't belong. And it's little touches like that which help bring the game's visuals together, though they're hardly all Stay Out of the House has to offer. For example, the player character actually has a little dark vision, but you have to wait for her eyes to adjust once you switch off a light source before everything fades back in. Even without all the extras, Stay Out of the House is just a good looking game with a retro style. I often find big budget horror games struggle to scare with their visuals, because the graphical quality is so high nothing is left up to the imagination, but that's not true of titles aiming for that old PS1 style. The textures and models give you just enough of an idea of what you're looking at, while leaving the finer details up to the player's imagination, so when you come across the really wild shit, it's that much more effective, especially with all the extra visual effects layered on top. There are little moments where words flash across the screen or the walls become a meat prison that just don't have the same impact when not hidden behind scan lines and static. The game's sound design is no joke either. All the Foley work conveys the weight and power of whatever's happening, whether it's you doing it or the killer. The butcher's footsteps echo through the house, and when he gets too close, the sound distorts to match the visual static on screen. His screams whenever he catches you or he stumbles across some of your handiwork are some of the worst best sounds I've ever heard. The gun roars whenever you pull the trigger. The VHS machine rattles and whirs. Appliances hum, TVs whisper, cameras click, your heart pounds between your ears. Seriously, what the fuck is that? My favourite sounds have to be from the lockpick though, because they're just so crisp. I could listen to them for hours. As for the voice acting, the butcher's screams are certainly the standout, but the recorded evangelical sermons you can find throughout the house aren't too bad either.
And you will soon see this perfect world take shape. Brothers and sisters, children of faith.
There are other moments of voice acting sprinkled throughout the game too, and they all feel genre appropriate without straying too far from the intended tone. There isn't much music. In fact, you're only really going to hear the soundtrack during the opening titles and the end credits. There's also a sting for when the butcher catches you. But what is there is fine. Like all the best horror, Stay Out of the House is able to get your hackles up without showing even a frame of the monster on screen. It's a very effective trick, but good as the audio and visuals are when thrown together, they're not enough to sustain a horror atmosphere over such a long game. I've mentioned in a couple of previous videos that it takes a lot to scare me these days. Not because I'm built different, but because I consume a lot of horror media on account of it being my favourite genre. I've covered a few other indie horror games on this this channel, and I wanted to talk about them precisely because they were able to scare me. But Stay Out of the House mostly didn't. It was certainly intense, especially whenever I found myself 1 or 2 hours out from my most recent save without another chance to do so in sight, and there were moments of spectacle that definitely gave me chills, but once I got an idea of the house's layout and saw through all its smoke and mirrors, it just became a prolonged escape room. I was always able to tell if the butcher was idling in the kitchen whacking away at his pile of meat, and I was always able to tell when he was patrolling the house thanks to the audio-visual cues. That the frame rate hiccuped for me whenever he teleported somewhere close by was a dead giveaway that I had to find a place to hide or get the hell out of the way, although your mileage may vary on that particular bug. That's part of the reason why I think the game should be played with all the extra visual effects turned on, so it can work its magic to the best of its abilities. Without them, the game was even less scary. Horror has to be up there with comedy as one of the hardest genres to work in creatively. Every scare has to land, every scream has to be earned. You can't rely on cheap tricks like jump scares, even if they do work, because after a while they become more frustrating than fun. Getting the audience to do most of the work for you is one way to do horror well, since the anticipation of what might be lurking around the next corner is always going to be way worse than whatever an author, filmmaker, or game developer can actually put there. Stay Out of the House actually does that really well at certain points through its presentation, as I've mentioned, but it's not something you can keep up over the 10, 12, 15 hours it takes to finish a first playthrough, and as a result of that, my 5-hour second playthrough was even less of a scarefest. It's the reason why you don't see many horror epics in any form of media, or at least not many good ones. The genre lends itself to brevity, which is why I found the game's opening chapters to be far scarier than the titular house. And it's here I'm going to smack down another spoiler warning, because we're going to look through each section of the game and what little plot it has in detail. The game's lore unfolds like a good mystery box show that is best experienced blind, so if you want to skip over the discussion on story as well as the juicier gameplay spoilers and get to the rest of the video, go to here. Damn, that's a huge fucking rat. Stay Out of the House doesn't begin at the front door of the eponymous domicile. It begins with you working the late shift at a remote truck stop on a desolate highway. Night shift puts you in the shoes of Deborah, a young woman just trying to make ends meet at her nothing job sometime in 1986. It's short, it's sweet, and it's actually pretty scary. I believe Night Shift was actually released as its own short game back in 2018, but was bundled into Stay Out of the House given the butcher appears as the main antagonist of both works. As part of Stay Out of the House, it acts as a short cold open, the kind of scene you get at the beginning of a lot of horror films where 1 or 2 disposable characters are introduced as easy victims for the monster to kill off before the opening titles roll and the real story begins, and that's fine. But taken as a work of horror in and of itself, I think it does a much better job of scaring you than the main bulk of the game. Deborah starts off surrounded by people, but her roommate and her co-worker are quick to leave because, let's be honest, it's not exactly a glamorous profession in an interesting location. It's quiet, it's lonely, it's boring. God, is it boring. The manager's left a couple of things to do, but sweeping the floor and putting all the unpurchased items back on the shelves takes about a minute. After that, there's really nothing to do but watch the seconds tick by. The phone lines are down, but there's nothing you can do to fix them, and there's no way to find the keys to the toilets either, since they've been missing all day. But there's always the Power Drill Massacre arcade machine in the corner to pass the time. I've never worked a night shift before, but I did used to work the morning shift at a pub, and the game successfully portrays how it feels to be stuck at a counter when the place is dead, just waiting for something to happen, only to wish it hadn't when it finally does. There is nothing more frustrating than having your game of Power Drill Massacre interrupted by a customer, especially when it's so damn hard. Not in a good way either. The killer can spawn from any of the blue doors around the map, and more than once I had him pop out right as I was passing by, killing me instantly. Mashing the spacebar on PC will make the player character run, and it is possible to juke the killer if you're used to the controls, but most of the time you'll just end up cornered and dead. The goal of any given area is to find free keys and then the exit, but each level shakes it up with different sorts of mazes, extra rooms, and even a few one-ups to find. The machine is actually based based on another puppet combo game of the same name, currently unfinished as of this video's uploading, but it looks like it's going to be the developer's next big release. What the fuck was that? That's the thing about the arcade machine. The rest of the truck stop is so unbelievably devoid of anything to do that Power Drill Massacre draws your focus like nothing else. It's easy to miss cars and trucks and customers stopping to fill up the tank when you're in the middle of the game, and it masks any strange noises you might happen to hear elsewhere in the building. The kind of stuff you drown out when you're focused on a game or a movie. Was that noise part of the machine? Something outside? Or is there someone rattling around in the back of the shop? Another cheeky thing about Power Drill Massacre is that each of the levels roughly corresponds to the path you'll take through the rest of Stay Out of the House, which is fun. I always enjoy it whenever stories do things like that. Night Shift doesn't give you as many gameplay options as the rest of Stay Out of the House, just by virtue of it not having very many mechanics. But one thing it does feature is a lot of dialogue. You can pick and choose your responses, but all they really do is fill in the blanks. There is one conversation that can influence the story, but it's minor and ultimately meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Instead, I think the dialogue options here are to give you the illusion of power. Night Shift ends the same way regardless of your choices, but that's not something you'll know on a first playthrough. The first time this weirdo wanders in from the highway without a car and asks you if you're here alone, it's a tense moment of potential danger, especially if you say someone's in the back, and then he goes over to check. It took me right back to a moment when I was working the early shift at that pub, when this one guy blasted out of his mind on some sort of illicit substance, came in and started beating up one of the poker machines out the back and yelling at people out the window. I just remember thinking, well, if the manager doesn't get here soon, this might be it for me. The manager did come running once alerted, and the guy did demurely leave when asked for what it's worth, as does Mr. Weirdo after a moment or two in Night Shift. But that's what makes it so effective for me. It totally captures the tedium of a job where all there is to do is stand at a counter and wait, along with the sudden spikes of terror when something finally does happen that you're unprepared for. And things only get worse when you go into the back room to find the staff exit unlocked and hanging open. This is the first time since the start of the vignette that you're allowed to go outside, and if you do, you'll discover the toilets have suddenly unlocked as well. After that, it's only a matter of time before he finds you. Night Shift only takes about 20 minutes to complete. It doesn't offer any answers to Stay Out of the House's big questions, it doesn't give you a big environment to play in, and what little area you have doesn't even have much to do. But it builds such a perfect mood, and recreates the tedium of a boring job so well, that I found it to be so much more effective than any other part of the game. You know the twist is coming from the second you hit start. It doesn't exactly break new ground, but it lets you stew in the monotony of the job just long enough to get your guard down before things go crazy. As an interactive horror short, I think it's perfect. When you regain control, you're playing as someone new. Roxanne. Welcome to the prologue. After a short introduction where you slip in and out of sleep while an evangelist on the radio preaches about God's truck,
But that's God's truck.
you wake up to find the car parked at an isolated rest stop and Roxanne's boyfriend Brendan gone. A little exploration outside the car quickly reveals something has gone wrong, and things only get worse from there. Prologue, like Night Shift, doesn't really feature any of the mechanics of the main game. In fact, it has even fewer than the previous chapter, lacking even a stamina bar to limit how far you can run. All you can really do is walk, run, and read. In that regard, it's very much like a walking simulator, but thankfully it has an atmosphere to match the best examples of that genre. The further you venture from the rest stop, the stranger your surroundings become. You stumble across an old abandoned mill rising out of the fog, there are dropped suitcases and random clothes all over the place, there's a dog, who you can befriend and pet. Amazing! Instant 10 out of 10. There's a maze hiding an abandoned van, the Church of Father's Vision. Huh, I wonder what that's about. The rows also lead to an old church, similarly abandoned due to the parishioners turning on the preacher, and, naturally, a house. I'm getting the vibe I should stay out of there. The prologue is a hike through dull muted colours and smothering Frog? The prologue is a hike through dull muted colours and a smothering fog, so when you do come across the house with its bright pink lawn flamingos and bold red windows, it draws the eye. It feels like the only living thing in the area, but it also feels wrong, like it's sick, like it's been poisoned. I don't think the house is guarded by flamingos for nothing. They may seem out of place at first, something kitsch to create dissonance with their spooky surroundings, but if you know anything about the birds, you know they're extremophiles. They make their homes in some of the most inhospitable places the natural world can conjure up, like Lake Natron in Tanzania. Here's what Hank Green in a video for SciShow has to say about it.
The water is alkaline, sometimes very alkaline. Depending on the conditions, its pH can be higher than 10. The lake's temperature has been known to hit 60 degrees Celsius. Any animal corpses unfortunate enough to land in the water end up mummified in a coat of minerals, and touching it is seriously painful for humans. Lake Natron is also the breeding grounds of the lesser flamingo. These flamingos have tough skin on their legs to prevent burns from the caustic water. The high temperatures don't seem to bother them either. They can submerge their heads in water that's so hot it's almost boiling. They've even been observed drinking boiling water from geysers with little to no ill effect. How they manage this is not clear.
The house is sick, alive but poisoned, hidden away behind overgrown farmland, an abandoned mill, and miles of chain link fences on the edge of a crumbling highway in rural Oklahoma. Even if you miss the warning signs, even if you miss the symbolism, everything about this situation is telling you, screaming at you, to stay out of the house. And if that's not enough, the dog will growl at the open door as soon as you get near. If you get too close, it'll run right in, and then... Oh, now that's a dirty trick game. Good thing I've always been more of a cat person, see ya! Inside the house, things are eerily quiet, but not any stranger than the rest of the game has been so far. The dog actually made it pretty deep into the house. It takes a trip all the way down into the basement to free it from the trap beside this switch box. I wonder what's on the other side of that door. Is that a bike made of human bones? Head back upstairs after freeing the dog, and you'll discover the front door has been shut and locked behind you, at which point the prologue ends. Either the butcher gets you from out of the darkness, or Granny scares you to death on her way down the stairs. To quote a friend, should have stayed out of the house. Oh, and don't worry about the dog. You never see it again, but it can just phase through solid objects, so it's probably fine. Wait, then how did it get stuck in the bear trap? Did you lure me here, you little bitch? Bad dog. Like Night Shift, the prologue is only around 20 minutes long, depending on how lost you get in the rows of corn outside the house, but that's what makes it so effective. The trek through the fog from the rest stop builds such an oppressive atmosphere that when you finally come across the titular house, you know exactly what's up. It almost feels like you've fallen off the map into some dead corner of the universe. You're so deep in the boonies now, if anything goes wrong, no one is going to be there to help, especially not in the 1980s. The search for Brendan and the car keys to get back on the road quickly shifts to a downward spiral through the woods until the game uses the player's own kindness to make them ignore its own advice. I think it helps that you're always on the move. Night Shift built tension by forcing you to endure the tedium of an enclosed space, but the prologue wants you to keep walking. It doesn't want you to linger. It wants you to pass by each abandoned structure in quick succession, always drawing you further and further from the highway with towers and spires and silos and scarecrows looming out of the fog until suddenly you're standing at the front door of the house with no way back. It doesn't give you enough time to get familiar with the environment or what you're up against. Everything comes at you like a fast-paced nightmare, and then suddenly it's over. It definitely leaves you with a lot of questions, but in a work so short, it doesn't necessarily need answers. It's brief, but effective in its scares. The same isn't true of the house. Like I've said before, a sense of dread is hard to maintain across such a long period of time. It is exhausting to feel that way for hours on end. Exposure therapy is a thing for a reason. Spend enough time around anything scary and it'll lose its effectiveness. The game's presentation fights tooth and nail to unnerve the player with the threat of the butcher when he's on patrol, but once I learned how he worked mechanically, he was nothing more than the occasional jump scare. The dude is dumb. But that's okay, because it wasn't the scares that kept me engaged throughout the house, but the process of escape and the freedom it gives you in achieving it. You start off locked in a cage beside a TV preaching about anger with a bucket and a pounding headache. You're meant to escape through a hole in the side of the cage, but the first time I played the game, I genuinely got stuck here for 15 minutes, and only found my way out when I stared at the TV until I died. Sacrifice is the first of the game's 4 endings, different from a standard game over given you don't actually die. Instead you get dragged down to this mysterious tunnel by the butcher, although the scene ends before you see what's on the other side of the door. The mystery of what's going on at the end of the tunnel is one of the game's biggest questions, though it's hardly the only one raised. If you don't just accept your fate and settle in for some trash daytime TV like I did and actually break out of your cage, you'll find the house overflowing with unanswered questions. Who is the butcher? Why is he so obsessed with the Church of Father's vision? Why are all these emergency supplies stored all over the house? What does he need so much meat for? What happened to Brendan? Is Deborah still alive? Why is the butcher still living here when everyone around him is gone? Is Granny's skull thick enough to stop a bullet? No. Seriously, what the fuck is that thing in the vents? Your journey through the house will actually answer quite a few of the questions. A newspaper clipping confirms Deborah's kidnapping from the truck stop, and that's not all. Seems that white van from Night Shift wasn't just cruising for a better fuel price at Deborah's truck stop. The butcher was casing the joint. Notes left scattered around the house by other escapees reveal the butcher can be cunning and violent, but there's not a lot left rattling around under that sack anymore, which explains why he seems to forget about you between encounters. There's also mention of screaming coming from under the house. There were tunnels down there. Looked like they went on forever. You can even find the butcher's diary and, it fails you. Yeah, he's got some issues. At least he's got a hobby. You've got to respect a man who can make his own furniture, although most of it is nothing compared to his masterpiece up in the attic. If you read through all of the butcher's diary entries, you'll learn he's not actually a cannibal. All that meat is being prepared for something else hidden underneath the house. He didn't start off abducting lonely night shift workers either. He began with the local homeless population, people beneath societal notice. The escalation isn't just to show how he's become more bold in his crimes, it's an indication of how desperate he is for bodies. He doesn't even seem to mind that some of his victims escape because that just improves the flavour. He used to be pretty articulate too, but spending too much time with his mate downstairs seems to have broken his mind. It feels you, but you definitely feel it as well. Every so often Roxanne will suffer from a moment of pain, but I'm sure it's nothing. I'm sure it's all fine. Eventually you'll discover you're not the only one locked up in the house. Brendan is here too, although by the time Roxanne lays eyes on him again, he's moments away from laying in pieces all over the floor. And given Roxanne doesn't react to this at all, I guess they weren't that happy together. There are a bunch of other survivors locked up outside too, including Deborah from Night Shift. You can save them if you want, or you can leave them to their fate, since as soon as you stumble your way into the backyard, the butcher will start dragging them away to join Brendan in the pile of meat in the kitchen. He actually hangs them up, strips them down, and butchers them too, in a completely different outfit no less. It's a brutal detail that's hard to watch, but I can't help but be impressed by its inclusion. Given I saved everyone in my first run, I only caught this on my second playthrough while recording footage for this video, and needless to say, I was a little bit shook. It was the only thing that actually actually got to me in this run. In fact, most of the scares in both playthroughs of the house came from having to deal with these NPCs. Escorting them through the house up to the safe room in the vents was one of the most intense experiences in the game, because if the butcher so much as thinks about the same room as the one you're in, they will run for their lives, except when they don't, which is understandable, but also very annoying when you're trying to keep them alive. Usually I was never able to find them again once they bolted, but one time I did go back outside to find this clown had locked himself in the kennel with this fucked up dog, which then proceeded to kill him the moment I noticed what was happening. I had no remorse for that time I accidentally shot him dead, because that's also something you can do. Pro tip, don't try to talk to NPCs while holding the revolver. Or do, because it was one of the funniest moments I had in my first playthrough. I got the guy all that way to safety just to blow his brains out across the wall. Everyone makes mistakes, am I right? Side note, but when I tried to recreate that moment for this video, this guy just tanked 3 bullets to the head, so I did what I could to make it work. Also, afterward, I went back outside to find Deborah in Dogtown, only this time the dog didn't even notice her. Instead, she just phased through the door to follow me when prompted, and that was weird. And when I reloaded an old save file to talk to all the survivors together in the safe room, they had no reaction to me killing them one by one. These NPCs are a little fucky is all I'm saying. I don't know what else to tell you. Each of the survivors has unique dialogue for when you save them, and most of them have an extra healing item or a hint about how to get the less bad endings as well. There's even extra dialogue if you go to say goodbye to them once you find the front door key. Even this poor woman who's too injured to move will give you an extra healing item if you bring her a wombo bar, though opening her cage will usually just result in the butcher immediately killing her as soon as he comes outside. The best part is, every interaction with the butcher's other victims is completely optional. You don't need them to complete the game, although like I've mentioned, they will make it significantly easier. What the fuck is going on in here? Now, as I've said before, I didn't find the house all that scary, but it was the most engaging part of the game for me because of the mechanical freedom it offered in the process of escaping the titular domicile. I had so much fun stripping control of the house away from the butcher piece by piece, room by room, until I was just as much at home as he was. There was only one moment of frustration, and that was this pit of barbed wire beneath the hallway in the attic. I fell into this stupid pit so many times trying to cover it up with wooden boards, it's not even funny, but that's really the only thing that sticks out before the end game. By the time you finish your last foray into the backyard, you're pretty much done. All that's left to do is get the can opener in the kitchen working to free the front door key out of this bit of tin. Or, if you're still looking for answers, you could always delve a little deeper. If you choose to run, the butcher will chase you through the night until you come to the nearest inhabited house. Oh fuck, it's you. Mr. Weirdo is the least of Roxanne's worries, since not long after he answers the door, something will explode out of her mouth, and that's where the game ends. Despite being one of the game's least bad endings, Escape is honestly my least favourite. So much is still left unanswered, and while Roxanne escapes, her victory is only momentary. It's just not satisfying. There's no closure. If the game ends here, it just feels unfinished. You know what that means then. We need to go deeper. If you manage to get the power on and find the code to the fallout shelter in the basement, you can proceed to the bunker. It's the final section of the game, and it is also by far the worst. Alright, it does answer most of the remaining questions without ruining the game's mysteries. A hard tightrope to walk at the best of times. But that's never what I was playing Stay Out of the House for. It's not exactly bad. The craziest moment of my first run happened in the bunker, but it feels unpolished, and it was certainly frustrating. The puzzle hints become harder to pass from flavor text, like how you need to use this steam pipe to dry out an old floppy disk. The game tells you the steam is warm when you click on it, yeah, but it's in an out-of-the-way room without any kind of environmental telegraphing like a bright light, and the last time you encountered a leaking pipe, the point was to shut it off so you could move past it. Turning off the steam in the vents of the house is one of the last things you do before venturing down to the bunker, unless you sneak the butcher's skeleton key off his hip to sequence break. So the idea of finding a way to shut this one off, or plug the hole, was still fresh in my mind when I stumbled onto it. It was also much easier to break the game while trying to sim my way past certain points that the house would have accounted for, because the bunker is much more rigid in its progression path. Instead of standing at the kitchen counter whacking at his meat, the butcher takes a trolley of offal down through the bunker to this elevator. I guessed correctly that I had to get into the elevator and ride it down to the bottom level of the bunker, but the game specifically wants you to go through this fan in the vents and access it through this grate in the roof of the carriage. I was lost and frustrated and hadn't figured out how to do that yet, so instead I hid in the darkness of the room beside the elevator, waited for the butcher to open the gate, which you can't do on your own, and shot him to send him away. Instead he vanished, as did the trolley, but the gate was left open. So I moseyed on in and hit the button and opened the grate to climb up onto the roof. Then as soon as the elevator reached the bottom of the shaft, the butcher suddenly spawned back in and began spinning fast enough to generate power to keep the lights of a small nation on for at least a year, while I watched on in confusion. I hadn't even started recording footage for the video at that time, but I had to Alt-Tab out and open OBS to catch the moment as it happened, because I knew I'd never be able to recreate it, and so far I haven't. He wouldn't even despawn when I started blasting. He was that mad. It's not just frustrating because I feel like similar methods worked at certain points during the house, but because there are other moments in the bunker where that sort of thinking does pay off. You can bypass most of the bunker just by shooting out a couple of doors that normally stay locked until the very end of the game. It's just disappointing. You can't even kill the pigs, but you can kill the cow? I don't get it. And to top off my complaints, the sterile white hallways and derelict offices just can't match the perfect atmosphere of the house. I bounced off the bunker so hard that I didn't actually get the game's final ending until I sat down to record for this video. Even the map layout just isn't as fun. There are fewer clever shortcuts. It's more like a series of hallways that open into separate rooms than the maze of the house up above. All that said, I did mention the craziest moment in the game happened for me in the bunker, and that's true. I'd just made it to the security room at the end of the vent, and after looking out into the hallway, I noticed that weird fucked up dog was on patrol. The dog is blind, but it reacts to sound, so I set out a bear trap and hid in the security room to wait. I didn't have a gun on me at this point. As soon as you enter the bunker, the door back to the basement shuts behind you, so you only bring through what's in your inventory. By pure accident, I just happened to have the bear trap and the hammer with me. The dog somehow dodged the bear trap, which is a bit crap, I have to say, and naturally it followed me into the security room. So I whipped out the hammer and started nailing Poochie into the floorboards. The violence drew the butcher, who ran straight into the bear trap at the door as I was beating the tar out of the dog, and I was so preoccupied with making it through the mauling that I didn't even notice when the killer ran off after freeing himself. I killed the dog and found myself alone, somehow alive. It was a moment of absolute simulational chaos, and it was great, but it was also really the last time I had fun with the game, and that's a shame. Bringing your bag of tools down to the bunker from the house is a really good idea because you need a couple of them anyway, and it saves you having to search out replacements in the new area. Actually, I think I would have preferred needing a new set of tools for the puzzles in the bunker, because just finding the same ones again feels a little repetitive. But I also understand that would have just added to the dev time and wouldn't even make sense. You don't use a bolt to do the job of a screw, but I don't know. Maybe it's just the fact they're lying around in random places rather than at obvious points on the progression path. They just feel like replacements in case you don't have one on you when you enter the bunker. They do definitely prevent soft locks, but I don't know, they feel cheap to me. I'm not really sure how else to describe it, and I certainly don't have an idea of how to fix it. In terms of gameplay overall, the bunker just reminds me of the final areas of games like Resident Evil 7 or Outlast. Sections that are very important to the plot, but don't really engage the player mechanically the way earlier parts did, which is a real shame because the environmental storytelling in the bunker is fantastic. You learn that the Church of Father's vision isn't just a cult looking to spread the good word, it's looking to make the nightmares real. It also might be a complete accident. One of the survivors in the house mentions milk Creek, or Cedarville, whichever it is, was rumoured to be the location of a secret government testing facility. Turns out the rumours may have been true. The exact details are pretty vague, like most of the game's backstory, but this much is clear. In the early 1980s, the bunker was home to something called Project Jolly. They were into some weird science, trying to induce physical mutations through some kind of signal. Radio broadcasts didn't seem to work, but they found better success with VHS tapes. Those sermons you've seen throughout the game are literal brain rot, an infection vector to send out waves and do something to whoever and whatever they touch. You even find the place where they filmed it, and the giant fuck-off demon machine they attached to the camera. Don't look directly at the lens indeed, no wonder it kills you instantly. The machine they used to create the corrupted tapes apparently needed a nuclear reactor just to keep it up and running, and you can find it buried at the very bottom of the bunker. But a little radiation leak between friends was surprisingly not the cause of Cedarville's abandonment. The scientists started off experimenting with its effects on animals, but soon switched to human test subjects. Eventually it started to affect the people working on Project Jolly, and even unintentionally spread to the surrounding town. You thought Mill Creek was killed with radiation poisoning, when it was actually demons. One demon specifically that Project Jolly managed to create through experimentation at the very bottom of the bunker. Eventually some of the workers had second thoughts and tried to shut down the project, but despite flooding one level of the bunker, they weren't able to kill whatever the eggheads like Dr. Tambor created at the end of the tunnel, and by then it was too late anyway. The Church of Father's vision had already infected the minds of all the locals, and then when the town died, they left to spread the good word through mail-order sermons on VHS. Yours for only $19.99, plus shipping and handling. Whether the butcher was one of the test subjects, Project Jolly staff, or a local resident affected by the signals emanating from the bunker is never explained, but by the time the game takes place, he's not only moved in, he's formed a symbiotic relationship with the demon. He keeps it fed with a steady stream of night shift workers, and it reveals to him the deeper horrors of the universe while keeping him functionally immortal. The ones the demon doesn't like get fed to the pigs instead. There's no one left from Project Jolly by that point, unless you count the animals they left behind. But at least one of the butcher's victims managed to escape, and figure out how to finish what the dissenters started. Cause a reactor meltdown, he tells Roxanne, right before he dies and gets eaten by a dog, assuming it's still alive by that point. Causing the meltdown is how you get the final ending, but you do have the option of going down the tunnel from the game over to confront the demon if you wish. Get too close to the door and the butcher will appear and knock Roxanne out, but when she wakes up, you'll finally get a glimpse at the thing at the bottom of the bunker. This is the rebirth ending, and even though there's nothing you can do but sit back and watch as the demon kills Roxanne, I think it is the most satisfying conclusion to the game. It's not a happy ending by any metric, but you do get answers to all of the game's biggest mysteries, and it ends on a moment of horrific spectacle. It's also the only ending I was able to break, since I was holding the revolver when the butcher grabbed me. Roxanne still had to quit after everything faded back in on the other side of the door. You can't pull the trigger. Believe me, I tried. But you can reload the gun if you want, which was fun, I guess. I'm glad I got this recorded, because I can't imagine this glitch is going to be around forever if the video ever makes its way to Puppet Combo. It works with the bug spray too, though sadly it seems to have run empty. That'd be a fun gag ending though, just kill the demon with a little squirt of Mortine. To get the game's final ending, you have to ignore the door at the end of the tunnel, and focus on the nuclear reactor. Getting to it was honestly a chore for me. The game sets you a very rigid path to follow unless you shoot your way down through the emergency exit that just wasn't all that fun to take. But get the keys to the terminals and input the shutdown codes, and that's it. You've got 5 minutes before the bunker busts itself. It's here that the game becomes a linear corridor of fire guiding you to the garage, where you'll have your final encounter with the butcher once the emergency exit is blocked by debris. I really didn't enjoy this fight. I found it to be a really sour note on which to end an already fairly sour section of the game. I didn't record my myriad attempts, but I thought at first the goal was to kill the butcher. Despite the fact he reacts to damage, you still can't put him down for good. Or maybe you can with enough bullets, but good luck reloading with all this shaking. When my attempts to take him down with violence failed, I turned to just running out the clock. I thought maybe eventually the debris blocking the exit would shift out of the way, but no. And if the clock hits 0, you just die in the reactor meltdown. So then I thought maybe I had to hurt the butcher when he was close to the debris so that his flailing would dislodge the garbage blocking the door, and that didn't work either. What you're meant to do is stun him somewhere far away from the door, and then mash buttons on the debris until all the fallen beams are out of the way. Something I never noticed you could do because my inventory was full of items that supersede any sort of environmental interactions. You can't interact with anything while the revolver's in your hand. The gun will just fire. The bug spray, the knife, and the hammer will just do their thing. The bandages will just be used, and even if you're at full health, they'll say you don't need to use them right now if you hit interact with them equipped. Like with the steam vent in the bunker, I think the objective could have been telegraphed better. Something as simple as Roxanne saying, "I need to move those beams," before the butcher appears would have been enough. Either way, once you clear the debris and run through the door, the game is effectively over. The reactor goes into meltdown, the butcher, the demon, and everyone else still in the house gets obliterated, sorry Deborah, and Roxanne wakes up in hospital days later. She still ends up birthing that weird worm thing out of her mouth, but unlike the escape ending, she doesn't die. Instead, she wakes up again in a twisted version of the hospital, filled with weird pulsating sacs, the same kind you can see around the demon's chamber in the rebirth ending. There's nothing for you to see out the windows, everything is surrounded by a red light. Leave through the front doors, and that's credits, baby. The mother ending left me as unsatisfied as the escape ending. It might be the only ending in which Roxanne actually survives, and the butcher actually dies, but the hoops you have to jump through to get it, and the myriad other questions it raises, just leaves me with a hollow feeling. To say nothing of how literally everyone else dies too. It's not like the worm doesn't come out of nowhere. It is foreshadowed, and once you learn the true purpose of the Church of Fathers Vision sermons, it's pretty easy to put together that this is the sort of mutation Project Jolly was trying to achieve, but it's still a weird place to end things. Horror as a genre isn't known for its happy endings, or even satisfying endings. Fair enough, but I don't think that excuses their absence, especially when it comes to the latter. That's why I prefer the rebirth ending. Roxanne dies, but you get answers to the game's biggest questions in ways that don't ruin the mystery of them, or raise too many more at the same time. The fates of the butcher's other victims are left ambiguous, assuming they're still alive, and even though the killer gets away without consequence, there's a chance he might be taken down if Deborah or any of the others manage to make it to safety. Plus, the rebirth ending feels like it takes just long enough to reach. The escape ending feels like it comes too soon, like I've already mentioned, and the mother ending feels like it takes too long, or at least they do for me. For a game that has such a strong start and such great mechanics, it is so disappointing that it isn't able to stick most of its landings. Aside from my issues with the late game, my complaints are really only nitpicks. Minor errors in the documents, or small graphical things like how sometimes you can catch moments when the game hasn't loaded in other parts of the house while climbing the basement stairs, or the occasional door latch that will always be locked when you reload a save, even if you unlocked it beforehand. There was also a room that always loaded back in with the lights off, even if the switch had been flipped to on. But to sum up my thoughts on Stay Out of the House overall, I find myself drawn back to a quote by Austin Grossman from an editorial he wrote during the development of Trespasser, on which he was the lead designer. Grossman wrote, quote, "The content of a game and its gameplay have often had an uneasy relationship. The delivery of story and the creation of an interesting, hackable system are not things we combine easily. Commonly they are kept rigidly separate. Genuine interactivity ends, or simplifies drastically, where story or story direction begins." End quote. Grossman's thoughts on story in video games have stuck with me during the research and production of my Trespasser Critique, which at the time of this video's uploading is still ongoing. But it was actually playing Stay Out of the House that ultimately brought me down on his side of the argument. Stay Out of the House features both heavily curated moments of story in its early acts, and a huge amount of freedom to play with its systems and mechanics in its main section, both of which were fantastic in their own ways. But in the late game, where both styles start to grind up against each other, it was nothing short of infuriating. It was frustrating enough to make me almost drop the game entirely, but it also made me want to talk about it too. I want to say that Stay Out of the House is a horror masterpiece, because in some ways it absolutely is. I haven't been hooked by a game this hard, only to bounce right off it after a certain point in a long time. It is, at once, too short, too long, awful to play, and an amazing experience. It also takes place in the shared universe of Puppet Combo's games, so even if it doesn't answer every question it raises, it does help to fill in the setting and explain some of the weirdness in a few of the developer's other titles. It goes to such lengths to recreate the look and feel of a title out of the 1990s, despite being extremely modern in a lot of ways. In ways you don't even really notice until you start pulling the game apart at the seams. For a game made by such a small team, it's absolutely an achievement. It made me want to go back and finish Murder House, which I also fell off. It has me looking forward to whatever Puppet Combo does next, and I never want to play it again. And yet, I can't help but recommend it to any fans of survival horror or immersive sims, even if those recommendations come with big caveats. Stay Out of the House does its best work in horror when it stops you from playing the game like an immersive sim, and whenever it does let you run wild with its systems and mechanics, it's just not that scary. I wish I could say that I loved it. But hey, at least it's better than Hello Neighbor. And that's the video. I've probably made a YouTube post about this already, but if you haven't read it, I'm still working on the Trespasser video, but as I've mentioned here and there, it's the biggest, most complicated project I've ever tackled for this channel, and it is currently eating me alive. There's an old saying that something rushed is bad forever, but a delayed project will eventually be good, so I'm going to stop committing to release dates and just get it done. They'll be short, videos like this one every month until then, and that's how we'll play things between the big releases I want to get done in 2024. Hitman 2 Silent Assassin, Tomb Raider, and if we're lucky, the Virus retrospective. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching.